cover this stuff more day to day. When you're covering corruption, I don't know, is it different from covering other things? Do you feel as though you need to qualify it somehow? Do you feel a particular responsibility?
I think there's a unique challenge in that, right? Like you want to present in a very nuanced and clear and articulate way what the allegations are, but you also want to temper it by noting that there are allegations and they're not proven, you know? And it is unfair to sort of besmirch someone and basically ruin their reputation before there is an opportunity to hear their side of it. None of us would like that to happen to ourselves, yet I think the natural and healthy skepticism that reporters bring to the job fuel an interest and an appetite in stories like this. You know, we all think that public officials, if they're not being watched, they're going to do bad things, illegal or not. When another government official says, here is our argument for why someone else is doing something wrong, it's very easy to run those stories very big,
right?
You know, and especially if there's diagrams and pictures and it's all media friendly. But I think there is a challenge that you sort of have to not be an organ of the prosecutor. You know, some prosecutors in a handful of cases have sometimes been negligent or delinquent in their responsibility to present what's accurate and fair. And I think in the case of Grimm, like he's been pretty steadfast in denying any wrongdoing. You know, I don't think all the coverage of him leading up to what the charges weren't presenting his argument as to why what he may have done was fair. Now, he shut down a lot of questions, didn't participate with reporters, failed to answer questions, and he's sort of responsible for what resulted from that. But just recently, there was a video that purportedly showed a New York City police officer stopping and frisking two young men dressed in traditionally Arabic clothing when minutes earlier he had let the same two people walk by when they were dressed in t-shirt and jeans. And it was picked up by the Daily Mail, it was picked up by Huffington Post, it was being tweeted all over, it was getting lots of views, it had gone viral by every definition of the word. No New York City media outlet really picked up the story, and when I'd asked the spokesman for the two guys who had posted it online, he assured me, this is a real video, but we're not going to give out information about where and when it happened. Leave us alone. And it later turns out that they admitted it was a quote-unquote dramatization.
Wow.
So what someone had presented as fact turned out to be not so. And again, that's much different than corruption, but you can't just simply run with the allegation that is being presented to you, even if it's from a reliable, credible source. You need to somehow independently verify it as best you can.
Right,
But
and also the politicians are in an interesting bind because they're running for re-election and answering questions and talking, but they also are effectively Mirandized. That anything they say, you know, they can't say, well, here's what really happened, because that might be something that's going to come down in the trial or in plea negotiations, so they're kind of fighting on two different
This is
fields.
a big problem right now for the Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, who his role in the Moreland Commission is really nebulous. It's hard to figure out. We tried to write about this and basically had to outline that it's really hard to figure out. But you know, we looked at sort of the legality and the politics of it, and politically for him, it's just terrible because while there's this investigation going on by Preet Bharara, the U.S. attorney, the Attorney General of New York State is pretty hamstrung when it comes to talking about it. That's a huge challenge for him. When it comes to the media covering these things, I mean, Azi makes a great point about having to temper ourselves a little bit, and that just doesn't happen enough because we are so competitive and we have such a fast news cycle, especially here in New York City, and that's a real challenge. And I know even myself, you hear indictment and you sort of, you feel like it's a conviction, you know, you almost have to remember, oh yeah, there's a whole legal process still to happen. And in a lot of these cases, the charges are beat.
And for prosecutors, you know, a public corruption win is a huge, huge. So sometimes there is a pretty clear overreach in terms of, you know, the kind of theory behind a particular indictment. I mean, like the whole, I think, what was it, Joe Bruno was the whole like honest services or fair service. And that's, you know, I'm not saying it wasn't legit in that case, but that could easily be stretched to a point where you're indicting people for stuff that, you know, is not on its face.
Right. Are you indicting people for committing politics?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
But here in Brooklyn, like, there's a clear example of prosecutors going way overboard, and how many people have been freed or been exonerated under District Attorney Ken Thompson, who's like looking back at Charles Hines' record, and those are criminal cases rather than public corruption. But you sort of get this example of the things that prosecutors present sometimes need a critical and fair examination before we all make a declaration about something.
Right. I also feel, and maybe this is kind of a luxury of having, between 5 or 10 readers a week at City Limits, is
but they're the right
10,000.
But they're the right ones.
They're high quality. None of them are corrupt. But I remember I did a story about the campaign finance system several years ago, and I went to a training, and I forget who was there. I think it was Councilman Thomas White was actually in the same training. It was during his kind of comeback campaign, and so you were being trained in the system and all the different rules you have to follow in order not to be someone who's going to have a fine assessed that we're all going to write about after the campaign. Took too many corporate contributions, didn't report sources, et cetera.
Right.
And he said, and he didn't know there was a reporter there. He was just talking to other kind of professionals. At one point during a break, was like, "This is ridiculous that we are going to be held accountable for all these sort of nitpicky things when Mayor Bloomberg, this was in 2008, I think, is going to spend $100 million on whatever he wants, and that's totally legal." So I always feel a certain tension between, the strict, and this goes to what you said earlier, the strict legal corruption, and then there's the, like the moral corruption that one might say is a larger part of politics, but no one's going to go to prison for.
You mentioned Tom White, the former councilman who had passed, but he was from Queens, and at my first newspaper, which was the Queens Tribune, I was covering his first run to come back into office after being term limited. And it just so happens that an executive at the newspaper was actively working on the campaign, which raises a whole bunch of questions that I did not feel comfortable with, and I even tried to include it in one of my stories. And I wrote about how much money he had raised from employees of JCAP, which was the drug treatment center that he was running while in between council terms. And you just go on the Campaign Finance Board website, you do a couple of searches, and you find out all this money. And again, it's not illegal, but it is a fair question to ask. You're raising money from subordinates. Is that appropriate? And if it's not, then like, just say it. And he, so like the story ran with, and he was in the office the very next morning complaining about it. And I belatedly heard those complaints directly from a supervisor. But the idea of like what's legal, what's illegal, corruption, money in politics, it seems that wherever people want to draw the line of inappropriate or appropriate, the bigger issue is whether or not there's even awareness or disclosure. And as long as you have disclosure, the fine line of what's illegal or not illegal, those can be debated and adjusted.
That's true, and that's where the sunshine thing comes in, so that people can theoretically decide for themselves.
Yeah.
I remember another Brooklyn politician, Bill Thompson, when he was comptroller. I wrote a story about how he issued they were doing stockholder actions against some of the companies that the city invests the pension funds in around climate change. And I was like desperate for something to fill the blog that afternoon, so I decided to look and see. And most of those companies that he was doing the stockholder actions against, like Keystone and stuff, had given his campaign money. And so I wrote a piece about how it was interesting that he, despite getting the money from these people, he's taking these actions against them. And I remember a couple of weeks later, I ran into a press officer for Thompson, who will go unnamed, who was furious at me because he said, "You wrote a hit piece about something we didn't do." And it wasn't meant as a hit piece, but the mere mention of sort of money and campaign finance, it was probably some poor writing on my part, but it was difficult to convey the nuance that in fact I was saying that he didn't do what we expected him to do.
There was a politician who has a generally good record on ethics and good government reform issues, holding office in one of the boroughs, who said to me,
"Look at the integrity
on
you."
I try, the one instance, 1+ ciders into the conversation. And this person said, in my district, if I'm even mentioned in a story about corruption, if it's even a confusing association, that they will feel the repercussions of it, and that they have to hold, and what they were saying was that they hold themselves to such a high standard, in part because they have such an engaged electorate, that they have to be unambiguously clear of how far along the spectrum they are in terms of good government, that even a story about it, like they have to be clearly wearing the white hat and being the good guys in the cavalry, whereas other people have constituencies that have different priorities, rightly or wrongly, where this kind of issue is just whatever. So when we write about stories, and it's like really sad because some of the districts that are most affected by corruption, by public servants who are not putting the public in front of their service, are the constituencies that arguably need it the most.
It's this question of, right, who's getting taken advantage of? Why I mean, this is another pre-Paybarah-ism, is we need the public. The public, it's not going to come from the media, and it's not going to come from the prosecutors, right? It's got to be those two groups, perhaps, spurring the public into action. Yeah. Can you get enough people upset about it that they insist that their legislators pass, some of these sometimes just boring sort of laws about financial disclosures and per diem stuff that would affect a lot of this and how people operate. And that's also asking legislators to sort of police themselves. And how much does that happen?
If reporters had the same kind of investigative powers as a prosecutor to like find this, to like subpoena stuff, and if reporters had the storytelling capabilities that sometimes a prosecutor does, of like, here's a diagram of what's going on. I mean, who knows what could happen?
We've all been out talking on election day or primary day to people. Does the concern about corruption ever really filter down?
It does. I think this is something maybe I said in a different form earlier, but I think it does when it's like the very clear, very direct money in the pocket type of way, right? Where like on the cover of the New York Post or the Daily News, you have someone going away in handcuffs or some really juicy headline. The Moreland Commission doesn't provide those things. So I think it's much more someone who's figured out a way to take some money from the taxpayers or something like that, where you'll get someone at a polling place being like, yeah, he's corrupt, I'm not voting for him.
Yeah, I think corrupt or wrongdoing, whatever silo it falls into, if it's a story about someone who has a double standard, or hypocrisy, a person, a Republican who might have advocated for kind of traditional family values getting caught with like a male prostitute. It's like, well, it's like salacious in so many ways, but it also is a very simple, clear-cut example of hypocrisy. If someone had denounced, the corrupt influence of money in politics, caught with a hand, caught with their hand in the cookie jar, that's a great example, and it undermines a lot of the other stuff they've done. I think the Times did great work in putting back the Moreland Commission into the front of the public conversation. When Cuomo had shut it down, there were daily stories written about it, and it sort of came and went, and the governor, in his management of the press, was effective in putting that in the back burner. And the Times, with the lengthy investigation, dedicating resources to it, giving the reporters time to report on it, and then placing it with such high prominence, put that story single-handedly back into the front of the conversation. I don't think there are as many outlets that do that. Like ProPublica, their whole, reason for being are these kind of investigative pieces, and they've done like one-offs about Cuomo and the use of his private email accounts and his transparency. We at Capitol try to spend time looking at data, on criminal justice issues, on finance issues, to see what else is going on. I know both of your outlets also do this kind of work, but I don't know if every outlet every single day is sitting there saying, who do we have looking at the bigger picture, and how much resources does that person or people need to tell the story effectively?
And it's not just resources. Like my mentor, Wayne Barrett, this is what he does, this is what he's done for 40 years. And I couldn't do it because it requires there's a certain discipline and a certain kind of endurance that's required to do it, because it's the same thing over and over again. You really do have to focus on it exclusively with the knowledge that everything you find, you can document it down to the last dot on the I and last cross on the T. It may not have an effect, but you really need to have, I think, almost a kind of Jesuitical dedication to rooting this stuff out, because obviously, and there's also the most effective editors of time and space that and if you're making choices, but because it doesn't matter that much to voters, and because maybe it doesn't always matter that much between covering corruption and covering some policy issue, or covering corruption and covering what people in a campaign are saying, so the voters know that. Corruption, frankly, doesn't always win out, and maybe it shouldn't always win out.
When you talk resources, you're also talking about a corruption story that could suck up the time that 6 stories could be written in, right? Of the sort of day-to-day that is also important to get out to the public.
Right.
I also think that, I think one area where this is done, but probably not enough, is digging into sort of the campaign disclosures.
Right.
And I would say, to try to directly answer the question, I'd say Chris Bragg at Cranes does a really good job of that. He digs into those numbers and will pull out, connections about money that's flowing different places that nobody else has put the time into.
Right, and I think also, well, who is the Wayne Barrett of today is like a great question that we can spend hours kind of.
He would say Wayne Barrett.
Right.
Yeah, yes, and very rightfully so. But there's also, I think, been a change in the media landscape. When Wayne was in his prime writing for the Village Voice, they were the alt weekly. The other news outlets, Rupert Murdoch emerging with the New York Post, they were generally seen as like that's the voice of New York City, and everything else is just sort of in the background. Well, today you have Mort Zuckerman at the Daily News publisher traveling to Israel with Cuomo. Right. What kind of signal does that send to his reporters about investigative pieces and what's going to be written about him?
Right.
You have Rupert Murdoch, clearly his news empire aligned more with Republican interests than with any other outlet. You have the emergence of, you had Air America like sort of come and go, but you have like Huffington Post, which was clearly designed to be like the counterweight to the Drudge Report. So you have like a fractured media environment where even if you do get a news outlet that has the ability to dedicate resources to investigating, well, is it going to be marginalized as a partisan hit piece? I mean, Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo, great reporter who did amazing work in terms of the dismissal of attorneys general around the state. And that was able to transcend again and get picked up by mainstream media. Can that same type of investigative work be done? We just saw the death of Ben Bradley at the Washington Post. Would a newspaper outlet have dedicated and allowed like 2 20-something-year-old reporters to report on something before the right wing, the left wing, and every other wing sort of like marginalized them or attacked them? Like I think that's a consideration that exists more prevalently today than it did 15, 20, 30 years ago.
And I think the competitive environment is part of that too. Wayne and his colleague Tom Robbins often talk about the old days and how if your editor was being difficult and you couldn't get a piece about some dirty politician in the paper, you would call your buddy at the Post and say, why don't you take this and get it in? And I think people also would sort of team up more.
I wait for Tom to call me with that problem.
Exactly. Maybe we should put our numbers on the screen. But I feel like there was maybe because there were fewer outlets, maybe because we all were reasonably more confident that we were going to have jobs next year. Right. It was easier to kind of team up and say, we're all part of this, and that way, when you did a story, everybody could really feel good about hammering it until it was totally dead. As opposed to now, I think there's some of that, but there's also a tendency to sort of want to move on to talk about your thing.
Well, there's also a couple things. Not to date myself here, but the internet has changed everything. The interwebs have changed everything in terms of like the speed of the cycle, and I think that's something that is a great reminder, I think, for journalists all the time, is about patience, is about how much you're willing to sort of take your time and dig into a story and investigate and make the extra calls and do the FOIL requests and do the things that need to be done versus like, I've got enough to go on here, let me get this thing going.
Right. Well, how would you write about Watergate in 140 characters?
Right.
If you had to.
Yeah. Speaking of dating yourself, like I remember when I got to City Hall in 2006, I was like the person on the outskirts who was writing for a blog that published several times throughout the day. And as the generation of reporters before me sort of moved on in some instances, and I sort of got a few more years of experience, I noticed that there were younger reporters behind me that were operating at a faster pace.
Right.
Thanks to Twitter, and not so much Facebook updates, but that was also having a factor. And
I think they might be juicing as well.
They very well might.
Definitely on
It's
steroids.
not all natural.
They might be. But the idea that I was sort of bumping up against reporters that were operating on a daily cycle, and now I was getting annoyed at people that were operating on like a tweet cycle. I was
Right.
like, wait a minute, how did I sort of see this transition? I haven't been here for that long. But the speed of news, I think, is also a factor. How would Watergate have been treated now is a fascinating question.
Yeah.
Would it have trended? I don't know.
We could probably figure out a way. I mean, everything is gate now, right? I mean,
Right.
when you talk about trends on Twitter, I mean, you attach a gate to everything because of that. But what happens now is
I wonder how many people even know that, like who are actually using
who know where it comes
like
from.
younger
Right,
users of
yeah,
Twitter
right.
and Facebook. Like,
But you're talking but you're talking about so much energy, so much time put into breaking stories, and this is a question of, if you talk about the Times expose on Moreland, you talk about the triple byline and the resources that were put into that, and the time it took, and these are huge considerations for outlets that are trying to make sure that people have jobs.
Early this year, I think well before any of the Moreland Commission came out, Cuomo had a lunch with some of the Times reporters off the record.
Dinner, I think.
Dinner.
Yeah.
An evening meal, and stormed out furiously, which you'd assume the governor probably does with many of his emails. I've always, working as I have always for obscure left-wing publications, those invitations rarely come, or at least they rarely come make it to me. Would you have an off-the-record dinner with a politician that you were covering? Is that a good idea? Because I think it's a bad idea, because I think it compromises you, because then it's like, you've sort of broken bread with them. You either feel kind of personally conflicted, or you are,
I mean, there are any number of times where a reporter will have an off-the-record conversation with someone, right? I remember the first time I ever was invited to coffee was with the chief of staff of a councilman who I was writing about, and I ran into my editor's office, and I was like so proud. I had accomplished a coffee invitation. I had made it,
you were so thirsty.
Pulitzer next week and
Right,
everything.
right.
And I said, well, how do I deal with it? How do I pay for it? And the editor at the time told me, if coffee is going to be what compromises you, then you really have many other problems.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
So I don't necessarily think it's bad on the surface of it to meet people in a comfortable environment where they're able to give you information off the record that you could use or not use, however that gets figured out. The problem arises if you withhold that information that you come across the person that you had met with. I think that speaks to a problem of reporters being popular. A lot of reporters I sometimes aspire to be, in some ways are celebrities in a way that they weren't before. They're on TV, they get book contracts, they're writing for magazines, they get booked on premiere shows that we all watch.
Like this one, for example.
Yeah. No, this is.
I literally was waiting to get this invitation, so don't knock it. But if there's an element of wanting to be popular and wanting to get the quote unquote inside, track on information that, a government official will give you, that will enable you to write a story before your competitors, that runs into conflict with one of the basic premises of journalism, which is to hold people in positions of power accountable. And you have to be able to write stuff that is uncomfortable about the people you know directly. One of the things I love about reporting locally, about covering local politics, is you run into people that you see all the time. Like, where I live, I run into neighbors who happen to hold office, and they will see me buying groceries, and I know that I've written about them critically, and they know where to find me. But if you lose the ability to write critically about the people that you see face to face,
Right.
then whether or not you have a dinner with someone is a minor problem. It's like, why do you have that pen in your hand?
But yeah, I mean, right. This goes to so many of the questions of what we do and what politicians do. It's these questions of ethics, these questions of can you look yourself in the mirror. You have to make these decisions every day about, hey, that guy's pretty nice, but I know this about them, and I'm going to invest, I'm going to look into this, and we're going to write that article. Or like, you know what, I think, he would probably be better in office than her, but there's still things that we need to write about him because we know, so I mean, you have to make those decisions all the time. I don't know that having an off-the-record dinner makes, the big difference one way or another. It's about how you handle doing that.
Yeah. John Miller, who was a former reporter that went to go work as the deputy commissioner for public information for the New York Police Department, who's now back as a deputy commissioner for intelligence and counterterrorism, he wrote a book called The Cell, and I remember reading it right after 9/11, and in it he talks about cops that were working the organized crime beat, and he wrote something in there that was fascinating, and you can sort of see echoes of it in the movie Heat, which is the fact that, like, some cops will go out to dinner and sometimes encounter at a restaurant or somewhere some of the people that they
the great Pacino De Niro scene.
Yeah, right. And they encounter the people that they're investigating, and there's like this gentleman's agreement that if you capture or catch one of our guys doing something wrong, if you play by the rules in investigating and you got one of our guys, well, we can't be mad at you because you did it fairly and squarely, and the other guy messed up to the point that you're able to catch him. If you as a reporter find some wrongdoing or find something even questionable, if you present that to your readers, the person that you're writing it about, so it's like they can't justifiably be mad if you've gotten information fairly and squarely, and you're just exposing something that they had done wrong. Who are they really mad at?
And this is a big difference when it comes to elected officials or their aides, is the people who recognize fairness and the people who just, it doesn't matter what it is, if it's critical at all, it's wrong.
Right.
And there's a huge difference. And of course, listen, people's jobs are on the line, and I get that. But there's a huge difference between people that we deal with every day, the people who are like, you know what, that article was fair, we messed up on that, or it's a very fair question to raise. We are upset that you wrote it, but it was fair.
They could be mad at how something's presented. They could be mad at, well, it's not fair that it was this high up or whatever.
Right.
But if you are accurate in portraying the facts, like, who is the person really mad at?
So how about we drink up and go have an off-the-record dinner?
All right, sounds good.
Cheers.
Cheers.